Hello and welcome to week 14 of Introduction to Diversity. Today we're going to be applying some of the concepts we talked about to a more global perspective. Specifically, we are going to be talking about the association between race and social class, but then we're going to look into other forms of conflict such as cultural conflict, institutions of cultural being, your ethnicity, for example, which also includes your religion, for example. So today we're looking beyond the United States, the comparative perspective. Okay? So again, as we've talked about this entire class, the origin of race was for economic purposes. The goal was for Europeans to maintain a dominant position over non-Europeans, those in a subjugated position. Okay? So in this way, by creating racial categories, your racial category, the group that you identify with, then was associated with whether or not you were able to rise up the social class ladder. So again, it's the idea that, not all white people have privilege, but all white people have access to privilege. Those who were non-white and non-male historically, for example, did not have access to privilege, did not have access to rise up the social class ladder, which means they didn't have access to education, good jobs, wealth, power, etc. Okay? So the world system theory basically says the way the world looked during colonialism, the age of empires, when Europe decided to take over the planet, for example, it still looks a lot like that. Your major powers still hold the highest, most elite social positions on a global standing. For example, in America, the average person makes $55,000 a year, whereas in China, the average person makes $7,000 a year. So again, why do American companies leave America to go to other sources? It's because we can subjugate those people more easily and pay them less money because Americans have more power than the average person in China, for example. And this is a pretty harsh way of looking at it. But if you look around the world and think about the countries that have held power for the last 500 years, does it still look like that? And you often hear it in words that I don't prefer to use, but they say first, second, and third world, right? And I don't like those terms because to me those are very negative, prejudicial terms, and that's it's an economic way of categorizing groups of people into countries, for example, and saying who has the highest gross domestic product and who has the best way of life, for example. So there's a lot of debate to that. But again, think about those who have the power: the United States, European countries, and then who's in the middle? Russia, a little bit. China's moving their way up now, so you probably see a little bit of income growing in China. Okay, so that's the idea of world systems theory. The way the world used to look like during colonialism, it still does. Okay, we also have ethno-national conflict, and this is the concept in your book that talks about any form of conflict over race, over ethnicity, things like that. These are ethno-national conflicts. Okay. So the book talks a lot about this idea of dominant versus subordinate groups. And this is what we've been talking about the entire time. This idea of whites dominating non-whites in the United States, this is a global phenomenon, but it might not always take the form that we look at it, okay? For example, in India, Hindus think that they are superior to Muslims. Okay, and so why does a Hindu think they're superior to Muslim? Again, you're looking at, hundreds of years of socialization and ethno-national conflict between two religions, two ethnicities. Okay, so again, the dominant versus subordinate group doesn't always take the form of race. It can take the form of sex, male versus female. It can take the form of religion, for example, Protestant versus Catholic in England, for example. And across history and across the globe, you're going to find tons of examples of these minor conflicts, okay? And we talked about it in earlier sessions when I talked about all the different forms of genocide, for example, that have happened on the planet. These are all examples of ethno-national conflict, okay? And again, this is a dominant group trying to subordinate another group, whether it's economic purposes or whether it's religious purposes or social norm purposes, cultural purposes. Okay, it's a very deep and rich subject, okay? And it would take hours and hours and years to really get into everything that's going on here. But again, when you look at the world globally and you look at social stratification, the ways we divide into groups, and then you got to figure out which groups have the power and which groups don't. Which groups are the dominant groups and which ones are the subordinate groups. Which ones have good high levels of life chances, access to privilege, and which ones don't have as good of life chances. Is poverty associated with health? Yes. Okay. Is poverty associated with intelligence? Yes. So those who have better socioeconomic status have less exposure to poverty, less exposure to the detrimental effects of poverty, for example, higher rates of education, better access to getting jobs, living in better neighborhoods, all of which are associated with where you're located in the class system. But the thing is, your race is such a factor historically in where you are located in the class system. So again, this argument that minorities across the planet, those who don't have power over their own lives, even this includes the working class, this includes women, okay? This includes non-whites in the Western world, for example, okay? This is all about one group trying to dominate another group. Okay, so again, the status of women and other minorities, including all the natives across the planet, for example, are affected by this colonialized planet that we live on and all the ways we divide into groups, and then where you're located in this class system is based upon whether you belong to dominant groups or to subordinate groups. Okay, again, because your power is based upon your sex, male or female, who's got the power, you know, your race, white or non-white, who's got the power, your religion, Christian or non-Christian, who's got the power in the United States, not in other countries, but United States, okay? And so again, all this evidence of social class and prejudice, you can look at just overall wealth, disparities of wealth between whites and non-whites, disparity of the income per year, disparities of educational attainment, okay? And so you can see where white European descendants, you know, European descendants that eventually called themselves white, maintained a dominant position in America by institutionalizing racism, institutionalizing form of prejudice, okay? Non-whites couldn't vote, non-women couldn't vote. Jim Crow laws further restricted people. It wasn't until the 1960s when a minority could even have any form of power over their own lives, okay? So again, world system theory says that, you know, whites and males in the Western world, for example, have had power for a long time, and they haven't lost as much as you might think, okay? Multiculturalism is this idea of embracing diversity. It's recognizing that all human beings are different, okay? And this is one way of overcoming racism. This is one way of encouraging people from diverse groups to not consider people your out-group anymore, to start considering all of humanity your in-group and embrace all of our differences, okay? This is a really interesting way of looking at diversity. But even multiculturalism, one big critique of it is it doesn't recognize how we institutionally oppress other people. And so these forms of institutional oppression have lasted so long that even if we embrace a multicultural perspective, this positive meaning toward diversity, will that undo the world systems theory? Whereas these dominant groups have power, even subjugated groups aren't going to be able to rise up. Is it a way for subjugated groups to rise up if we embrace more multicultural attitudes? By embracing diversity, embracing multicultural attitudes, does that level the playing field? Okay, and so there's some big questions to be asked. When you look into forms of race globally, again, this idea of white and black, this is, you know, an American phenomena. This is just over here in the West, okay? Other, universally, race might not be based upon biological traits or skin color, even though our race is based upon no accurate biological traits. They tried that. Based on skin color, country of origin, okay? In other countries, it might be, you know, what religion are you? Okay, does a Jewish person think they're of a different race than the rest of the planet, and then their race would be based upon what religion there are? Does a Hindu think that they're a different race of someone that's a Muslim, even though they're both from India? Okay, because again, Pakistan is now split from India in the 1940s when Gandhi couldn't unify the country after World War II. So again, but they all were one people for a very long time. So again, is a Hindu a different race as a Persian? Are they all Asian? Again, a lot of questions, okay? So the book starts talking about words like mestizo. And mestizo is the word that got me into race in the first place. Because I was like, what is mestizo? European mixed with native. Am I a mestizo or am I white? So one of your discussion questions is discussing this, you know, are you really white, or maybe you're mestizo or mulatto, European mixed with African, okay? These are all words you've never heard because you live in a racial system, whereas like in Latin America, you're gonna have a color gradient system. How light-skinned are you then dictates your social location, okay? There's a big association between whiteness, lightened skin, and where you're located. Because in Latin America, there's too much blending, so much blending that it's very unclear as to who's what's race, okay? So the color gradient is just range from light to dark. And where you are on that range then dictates your access to power. Okay, because people that are really dark in Latin America have less power than people that are kind of blended, either mestizo or mulatto, a little bit of European and native, a little bit of European and African, and then someone who's of pure European descent. Even though people from Europe are not pure, they're all mixed with African, Persian, Russian, so Europeans are all blended themselves. So the mulatto escape hatch is this idea that if you're not totally black or you're not totally native, you can get into the middle class. Okay, so like in Latin America, the middle class was open for mestizos, but they were blocked out of the upper class because they had some European, but not enough European, for example. And so when you start to look at Latin American history, that's what you start to find is that a middle class is really just a blend of different races. And if you're more dominant toward leaning toward one race, like more leaning toward African, then you end up in a lower class than someone who's mestizo or mulatto, for example. So that's something really interesting your book talks about. Again, other forms of racism that you're going to see. In Israel and Pakistan, it's ethnic conflict, okay? But is this racism or is this ethnic conflict, the ethno-national conflict? What is really going on with Israel and Pakistan, okay? One, do they think of themselves as different races? And two, are they just different ethnicities? And three, is it just country versus country? What's this kind of conflict all about? But it's the same thing with the conflict that you see in America between whites and non-whites. It's a similar conflict that you see between like Israel and Pakistan, for example. And India, I'm so sorry, I need to fix that. Israel and Palestine. India and Pakistan is the same thing because, again, that's Hindus versus Muslims. Do they think they're a different race? How do they feel about that, for example? Okay? So the age of colonialism, again, this is what backs up the idea of the world systems theory. During the age of colonialism is when you start to see the rise of capitalism, okay? And so with the rise of capitalism comes this need to concentrate capital into the hands of the few. So the goal of European was to concentrate the hands and to concentrate the capital in the hands of the few, which really just meant European males. So European males, when they started to conquer the earth and spread all the way from China to India to Africa to Latin America to North America, and then all the way, of course, up to the Arctic and all the other places we've now explored, you start to see that Europeans put themselves in a position of power everywhere they went, okay? And the goal of colonialism was to maintain that position of power so that you can be gaining capital, okay? So the idea of colonialism is that this is the beginning of capitalism, which is the beginning of dividing into social classes, not just like the king and the non-king, kings, lords, and non-lords. It's gone much more extensive than that because capitalism created this global market. Okay, so then it becomes the rich, the middle class, and the lower class workers. And depending upon your race, your sex, your religion, your country of origin, dictates whether or not you have access to capital. So again, when you're looking at an introduction to diversity class, the most important thing you're going to be looking at is this idea of access to capital. It's all about access to capital. What was the purpose of race? Access to capital. By instituting races, you denied access to non-whites from competing with white people for capital. So what's the whole origin of race? Why was race socially constructed? For capitalism, for economics. So Europeans can maintain a position of power over non-Europeans, okay? And maybe you start to question if you're white or black when you start to think that race is really just all about money, because that's what it's really about, okay? I hope you guys really enjoyed this week. If there's anything we can do, please email.